No.
I am very grateful to the Right Honourable and Learned Lady, but I wonder if she could say something of her own position in relation to the precedent set by the Judicial Committee of the House of Lords, when a decision on which Lord Hoffman was involved was set aside not because he was biased, but because of the perception of bias. In relation to her famous tweets, how does she think she met the Hoffman test?
Well, I'm happy to answer the point that's made. I was appointed by this House in the expectation that I would chair the committee with no one speaking against it. After the tweets were brought to light and were highlighted, because I am concerned about the perception of fairness on the committee, and I agree that perception matters, I made it my business to find out whether or not it would mean that the government would not have confidence in me if I continued to chair the committee. And I actually said I am more than happy to step aside because perception matters, and I don't want to do this if the government doesn't have confidence in me, because I need the whole House to have confidence in the work that the committee has mandated. And I was assured that I should continue the work that the House had mandated with the appointment that the House had put me into, and so I did just that.
Boris Johnson did not, knowingly or intentionally, mislead this House. The reason, if people would like to listen, that I say that is that last year for 6 months I was one of Boris Johnson's parliamentary private secretaries. And I was the only Member of Parliament who was with him for the whole day on the publication of the Sue Gray report. When he read that...
Very grateful for the Honourable Lady giving way. She says, having read the report, that she sees no evidence of Boris Johnson's wrongdoing. Does she agree with me that there is none so blind as those who will not see?
Well, I thank the honourable gentleman for his comments. But for those people who haven't got anything more interesting to do than actually spend their time reading the whole of the report, of which I did, I am aiming this at members of the public, is that I suggest people go to pages 85 to 88 and actually read the quotes. The reality is that there were some people who had parties. Sadly, those people were unelected officials who still should have stood by making sure that they weren't having ministers potentially in difficult situations by advising them incorrectly.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Prime Minister headed all of those people. He was the team leader for all those working at Number 10 and in the Cabinet Office who were at those parties. During lockdown, I volunteered at West Middlesex Hospital, taking food to the wards because the staff working in them were not allowed to go to the canteen, and they certainly were directed by the Chief Executive of the Hospital Trust that they could have no parties, not even leaving parties, not even Wine Fridays. They had no parties for that whole period. Does the honourable member have any comprehension of what her constituents in the same position were feeling like when they heard the evidence?
I thank the honourable lady, and yes, I do. But what we need to look at here is actually what I witnessed firsthand, and what had happened was that people advising the then Prime Minister at no point advised him that there were parties. They advised him again and again. No, I won't give way at the moment, thank you. They advised him again and again that no rules were broken and that guidance was followed at all times.
It is clear, therefore, from what I have said, that the accusation that the former Prime Minister had deliberately or knowingly misled Parliament, as set out in the current and existing 1997 resolution put together by Tony Blair and by John Major and endorsed unanimously by the House as a whole can only be derived from a proper legal interpretation of the words on which Boris Johnson was relying and from the legal advice he had received inside Number 10 on each occasion of which he is accused. And I find no publication of that legal advice in this report. He, Boris Johnson, therefore, in my view, cannot have been found guilty of knowingly misleading Parliament if no lawyers, let alone the Prime Minister is not a lawyer, could get the legal position right. The regulations and the guidance entirely lack legal certainty, and therefore the Prime Minister could not have knowingly misled the House. Why, if, as I believe the case, did the committee not obtain evidence from those lawyers in Number 10, providing that legal advice in Number 10 when it was so crucial? And if they did, why has this evidence not apparently been published? He cannot therefore have knowingly misled the House. And that should have been the end of it. I don't see how contempt can be attributed in these circumstances, for he simply could not have knowingly misled Parliament on any rational interpretation of the word knowingly, which the original motion left out. Those who argue that now the report has been published, it's all over and done, and those who say the dogs bark but the caravan moves on, miss the wood for the trees. The caravan of this House, having moved on, will certainly come back, and then the dogs will not only merely bark, but they will bite.
Based on this, seems to me, tendentious reading of the facts, we come to the sanction, a 90-day sanction. Well, a vindictive sanction, it seems to me, which they can't implement because Mr. Johnson has left Parliament. So they go from the vindictive to the ridiculous, with not allowing him a parliamentary pass. Well, of all the trivial sanctions you could impose on somebody, that seems to be the most miserable. But they emphasise that this sanction, and let us turn now to paragraph 229, that this sanction has been made more savage, more brutal, more vindictive, because Mr. Johnson impugned the committee and undermined the democratic process. On what basis, Madam Deputy Speaker, is it thought that this House, when it comes to a conclusion, must be obeyed? Is it the case that we must not criticise the Dangerous Dogs Act because it was passed by this great and noble House? Or are we, in fact, allowed to criticise as a fundamental of free speech that which happens to us, that which is reported about us, that which is said of us? When somebody is in court, they are allowed to say that the court has made a mistake. And the protections of courts, of the junior courts with juries sitting in them, are quite rightly very strict. But you can still say that the court has got it wrong. Indeed, you're allowed to say it's got it so wrong that you may go to appeal. You don't have to kowtow. But for some reason, the Privileges Committee thinks it's in communist China and that we must kowtow.
And I wonder if I could draw her attention to paragraph 20 on page 71, which seeks to go much further than that. It talks about, it's not what the Prime Minister said, it's the interpretation given it by members of this House, by the media and by the public. The former Prime Minister Boris Johnson cannot be held responsible for what people thought he may have meant. He should be held responsible, if this report is to hold any water, on what he said.
I know people lost loved ones. I did too. But the storing up of hate for these people won't bring our loved ones back. So I ask for their own sake, somehow we need to find it in our hearts to move on. The right honourable gentleman has lost the top job. He has now resigned his post as a Member of Parliament. Trust me, he has paid the price. As for the young people in the video, they should have known better, and they really don't deserve to be honoured. But I cannot ask the public to forgive and not do so myself. So I do.
I was going to say, in terms of our mental health crisis, that is a scandal worth reporting. The fact that it cost $400 billion, the fact that science was misused and trust abused. Lockdown was an experiment, and I do think sometimes the focus of the lockdown debate to be around the behaviour of the Prime Minister, I think, is too narrow and does not do this House a service. As I say in winding up, I will vote to support this. Privileges Committee report, but I do wish, Mr Deputy Speaker, that the same level of interest, especially from the opposition, may sometimes focus on the stuff that actually made a difference in lockdown and not just vindictively going after Boris Johnson.
And I have to say, as I do respect the amount of hard work that has been put into this report, but throughout, if I was grading this in my former job as a college lecturer, it is not impartial. The way it is written, Boris Johnson claimed, Boris Johnson purported. This is not impartial language. And therefore, I believe that, in my opinion, that this report does not give an impartial report in the way that it is written.
I will vote against it because I think the process is flawed. I will vote against it because pleasing the opposition won't bring back the loved ones for my constituents. I will vote against it because the right honourable gentleman has already left, so the vote, in some cases, is already futile. I will vote against because I think the right honourable gentleman has been punished enough. I will abstain because I will vote against because if I ask the people to forgive, then so must I.